Hello everybody, welcome back to the fourth installment of this series about the hidden dimensions of fatedness in your birth chart having to do with eminence. And in this video I will be discussing a specific topic having to do with what Valen suggested about charts that are eminent, because up until now I have presented the three methods of investigating eminence factors, which is the spear bearers, triplicity rulers, and the fortune houses. And these were sometimes pretty obvious and sometimes they were a bit confusing. And I'm not claiming that I have resolved all the confusing issues, as you will see in this presentation as well, because some questions are still open to me, that is. And again, if you know answer to some of them, please comment in the comment section in the replies, and please mention the source from which you investigated this specific interpretation then. So okay, let's have a look at what I will be doing in this video. So the general topic of all these investigations is about these things that were mentioned by Vegis Valens, that images and planets operate differently in eminent charts, whether or not we can attest to that, or the lives of the eminent persons, whether or not they really show this, or this can be investigated, because we do not have specific delineations about what the exact difference is, but we can try to investigate it and try to come to grips with that. So again, eminence needs to be determined beforehand, because the benefics and the malefics function differently in these charts. So that's interesting. So let's have a look what I will be doing in this one. So the question I will be addressing in this one and in the next video is the way in which spear bearers really protect the native and perhaps harm bystanders. But the first one I will address, the first issue, is that one relating to protection of the native, or protection of some things that the native does or whatever. And for that I will be using the chart of Adolf Hitler. And there's of course this disclaimer, because I in no way, shape or form is this an attempt to rehabilitate him, nor is it an expression of any sympathy for his ideas or whatever he caused and for what he was responsible for. But the reason I chose his chart is because of this, because there have been, according to this author, 42 attempts on the life of Hitler during his career, which is pretty interesting. Other authors claim that it wasn't exactly 42 attempts, but somewhere in the range of 20 attempts, or a little bit more perhaps. But again, if that should be the case, it's really quite astounding, because to survive 42 or 22 attempts on your life is quite something. So the idea of protection is pretty much here, because Hitler was not protected by his soldiers or whatever. He was simply quite lucky in escaping all these attempts. And that's really a very interesting and fascinating study in itself. So let's have a look at his chart. And what I will be first doing is investigate his eminence factors, trying to see whether or not his chart really reveals the eminence that he got, because he was simply a very powerful person, and we can really claim that he has a claim to fame, even though it's a bit of a bad one. So let's have a look. So let's first have a look at his triplicity rulers, the angularity of them or not. I forgot to mention that the reason why I took the chart of Hitler is because there is much known about his life, even though some of it wasn't quite correct, because it was provided to us by Albert Speer, who was really fabulating a lot about what happened in the Second World War, the period of 1940 to 1945. So we cannot take his word as truth, but a lot of has been investigated by several authors about the history of Hitler and his rise to fame, rise to power. That's a better word, I think. So again, back to the triplicity rulers, the angularity. We see he is, of course, a day chart, so we need to check the triplicity rulers of the image of the bull, where his Hēlios is. So we have 3 triplicity rulers, the first one being Venus, the second one being the moon, and the third one being Mars. So interesting things about these, but when you look at the location in angular or non-angular houses, you can see that the second triplicity ruler is the most fortunate one and the most strong one. And the first one is reasonably strong, but it's also much afflicted by the third one, which is Mars. I'm not sure whether or not you should use this combination as to try to determine the first period of his life. But the interesting thing is that he was much interested in arts, etc. If we look at the fortune houses, you can see that there are there's one fortune angle very strong, which is the one where the moon, the second triplicity ruler, is. And of course we know that he rose to fame, as it were, in the second part of his life, which is of course under the rule of the second triplicity ruler. So the first triplicity ruler is in a succeedent place, the 8th place in the bull, which is reasonably good for eminence. It's not bad, but it's not the best place, because that would be angularity. And you can also see that Venus itself is conjunct Aries. Aphrodite is conjunct Aries, who is in his anti-domicile in the bull. And both Venus and Aphrodite and Aries are not of the sect in favor, which is also very interesting. But as some of the definitions said, that is not always a bad case, especially when such a planet is in its own domicile, in its own places, and then not referring to houses, but referring to the image in which they are. And we see here Venus being in its own domicile of the bull. And interestingly enough, the Venus is of course also the ruler of his first place, so sort of personifying Hitler as a person. And the interesting thing is that he was much interested in art, of course. And as you can see here, to me this is not amateuristic at all. This is pretty neat painting, according to my conviction, but art history persons who've studied it will certainly have a lot of comment on these paintings, depicting them as he was often depicted as sort of being a mediocre artist, but the point is that point of fact is that he was rejected of the Academy, I believe 2 or 3 times, which was devastating to him. And there you can see perhaps the conjunction of Venus with Mars. Mars is always interfering with anything that Venus tries to do. But at least this was certainly the case for his artistic inspirations. And he later persons said that he was quite able to draw buildings, etc. He was much interested in that, together with a Speer, of course, Albert Speer. So that was an interest of him, but he could really draw quite well, even though it was perhaps on a somewhat sub-level compared to real masters of this art. So, but that was a big thing for him because he was rejected for that. So okay, that's interesting to know in this first period. So, and the first period also had a period of quite severe poverty in his life. So that was his period in Vienna. So that was really quite difficult for him. And then the First World War came, and then he was a soldier in the trenches, etc. The second triplicity ruler is, of course, Sēlenē in a pivot, and she is the dispositor of the lot of fortune, which is in the crab. She is natally placed in the 4th place, the 4th image, which is, of course, a place of strength, pivotal, and she is also conjunct Jupiter, which is also the best thing to have, because Jupiter is of course a planet belonging to the sect in favor, and they are these two planets, Sēlenē and Jupiter, are both not in favorable places, but the question whether or not they are hindering something is not quite happening here. And that has a lot to do with the fact that these two are angular and they are also in an angle of fortune, so that's quite interesting. So we know, of course, that his second period was the most fortunate one, because he rose to power in the second half of his life, and in the end he destroyed his power and his fame and everything that went with it, and also the country that he represented. So these two, the second triplicity ruler and Jupiter, both having this position of fortune, a lot of fortune, it's just, being placed in an angle relative to fortune itself, is very good for Eminence. So, and we can attest to that. He rose to fame in his second period of his life. But let's have a look at another issue relating to these the first triplicity rule of Venus and Mars, because something can be said about the issue of strength. So let's have a look at that. So reconsidering strength, I return to something that Robert Schmidt investigated and talked about and tried to conceptualize, because when the translating of Hellenistic Greek text was first done, something that really was first noticed was the difference between whole sign houses, or in my parlance whole sign places, because the word house is not exactly the right term for the places, because the images of planets is referred to as domicile, and a domicile is actually a house. So when speaking of houses, we actually refer to the domiciles of the planets, which is the images in which they have a certain amount of responsibility. And when we talk about the images as places, then we are talking about specific topics. So here again, Schmidt made the difference between the topical purposes, which is the whole sign place system, simply the 12 images counted from the rising image, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And he called that the topical house system. And the other one, which was always used together, was the something having to do with the strength of a planet, and that is that these early astrologers noted that planets seemed more powerful in some parts of the horoscope than in other parts of the horoscope, and that has to do with what Schmidt now called a dynamical system, to contrast it with the topical system. So remember, there are two issues for people investigating Hellenistic astrology. This is not big news because it's well known. We have topical issues and we have dynamical issues having to do relating to strength. So let's have a look at the whole sign house, whole sign place system, which was considered like this. There are three places, actually, the angular places, what we have become known as cantra or pivots or stakes, and these will show greater than average activity simply because they are in a pivot, which is a very central and very dynamic, the most dynamic places in a chart. In modern parlance, these are angular places, and as I always ask, where can you find an angle in a circular image? You can't. So these are cantra pivots. We need another word for that, and the modern neo-traditional word for that is stakes or pivots in English. I still have difficulty trying to find a good Dutch word for these places, because I do not want to call them angular places anymore, but I haven't found a right word for that. The succeedent places, which is the places following the cantra, they succeed the angular places. These were called epinaphora, rising after. So these are average activity. It's a little less than the angular places, but not as strong as the angular places. And then we have the declining places, will show less than average activity. They are called the apoklima. Modern astrologers call these the cadent places, which are the places turning before the pivots. So, okay, that's what this strength issue is. And the question then is, for what are they actually active? Well, they are, of course, active for the significations of and for the topics of the places that they are in. And then you can determine whether or not this is a very a greater than average activity, or less than average activity. And when these planets are also in their own dignities, so if they are in their own houses, which are the images in which they have dignity, then they are also great activity in producing their own significations. That's a very important difference, having to do with the location being in a place, which is the modern house, and when these planets are in their own dignities, in their own places, as they are called, their own degrees, etc. So that's the issue. So when we're talking about strength considerations, then in this case, having to do with wholesome places, we are talking about the strongest, the strong places and the weak places, and these are given in certain percentages. Whenever a planet is angular in modern parlance, and in ancient parlance, when it's pivotal in a stake, then that planet is really one of the more strong planets manifesting in the life of the native. It's strong when it's in the succeeding places, and it's relatively weak as compared to the other planets in the other places. In one chart, then these only produce for 25%. I need to say that when a person has all his ancient traditional planets in cadent places, in the places falling away from angles, which is the 12th, the 3rd, the 6th, and the 9th, then you must conclude that these planets are the ones who are producing the most effects for the life of the native. When you have all the planets in one of the cadent places and only one of them in a strong place, in an angle, in a pivot, in a stake, then the one in the stake will dominate the life more than all the other planets in the 12th place, or in the 3rd place, the 6th, or the 9th. So please keep that in mind. There's a difference, and the difference has to do with the power to manifest. So Schmidt had something to say about this, and that's an interesting study, so I'll introduce it here. It has to do with the word krematizo, and there are two principal actions associated with this verb in ordinary Greek usage, and the first one is having dealings with use items such as money, and that has to do with negotiating and then actually transacting or conducting business of a profitable nature. So that sounds a bit business-like. So planets being in strong places are really able to conduct profitable business. The second one has to do with dealings with issues that require an answer, and that is very interesting because that is sort of the oracular power of planets. Whenever a planet is in an stake or is a succeeding place, then it's actually capable of delivering an answer of a question asked about it, because that's what we astrologers do. When you want to know something about relationships, you ask questions, sort of, about, for instance, the 7th place, having to do with marriage and partnership. And then the question is the planet that is in this place, or is the dispositor of this place, the lord of this place, the ruler of this place, then the question is whether or not the location of that planet suggests whether or not there is a clear answer to the question asked by the astrologer for this topic, for this person's life. So that's an interesting take on the idea of krematizo. And of course, astrology is and was an oracular science, right? So Schmidt also said that this verb was already encountered in other places, and then it referred to the planets and to conduct business in an advantageous manner, which is business advantageous for the native, of course. And the interesting thing is that this refers both to the place and the images in which a planet is. And there's an example I found in one of his definitions. And when Kronos is in its own place, which has to do with houses, and the image where it is, in its own images, it conducts its business, krematizo, in its chariots, that is, and by being set in a good position, which has to do with the place location, it benefits the native. So please remember that whenever a planet is in its own domicile or in its own degrees, is perhaps a better signification of this, then you can say that this planet is really producing something in a beneficial manner of its own significations. And that can be attributed having to do with the place that it's in, the house where it's in, but it can also have something to do with the universal significations of the planet all by itself. So whenever a planet is in its own places, it can manifest its own natural or universal significations. It cannot do that when it's in a place not of its own, not in its own degrees, so to speak, but under dominion of another planet, and then that is not the case, or to a lesser extent. Please keep that in mind, because that's a very important principle of course, astrology. And the opposite condition is being akrematistos, which is simply without ability to conduct business in an advantageous manner, not advantageous for the native, which is most probably planets being in the weak places and perhaps also hindered by other planets. Then they are totally without ability to conduct business in an advantageous manner. So these are the definitions having to do with this principle, with this doctrine in traditional astrology. So again, these are the things related to us by the planets having to do with the whole sign place locations, and then we can use the other ones, the strength, by means of cusp houses. Cusp divisions are found by different procedures and distributing them across the chart. They divide areas into zones of greater or lesser activity. So what is the difference between them? Well, for me this is about these principles. You can say that, or surmise that planets are in wholesale places has to do with their ability to produce the significations of the topical place itself. And when you're talking about strengths by means of cusp houses, then it's about the ability to manifest themselves. So you can have, for instance, a planet that is angular, but when it's not in its own places, it is has a strong ability to manifest. What it manifests is of course strongly dependent on whether or not it's in its own places, in its own degrees, and what it's representing in this specific place, because when it's the ruler of the 12th place, then you can understand that it's manifesting something having to do with the 12th place in a very strong way. But whether or not that is beneficial for the native is of course the issue here. So that depends of course on the nature of the planet itself, and etc, etc. You know the deal. Oh yes, and when we are talking about houses, cusp systems, the question of course becomes which one do you choose, and there are many systems of calculating cusps, and the question is whether or not they are used correctly, because they are often used for topical inquiry, and the great discovery in Hellenistic astrology was that they were not used for that, they were used for strength considerations. So that's an important thing to take into account. When I started learning astrology, I was learning to use the Placidus house system, and it seemed quite natural to do so. But since the study of Hellenistic astrology, it became quite clear that it's quite randomly introduced, because students who were taught astrology by using Koch houses thought that these were the most natural way to divide the zodiac circle into regions of strength. So that's quite, it's simply depended on who your teacher was or what school you were taught in, and that was the house system the cusp house system that you started to use, and felt very difficult to leave behind. So when I learned this, I had a great difficulty of integrating these two separate things, because I was always thinking about the topical issues related to, for instance, Placidus houses, and then I needed to reinvent astrology for myself using the whole sign places, and now I even do it for horary charts. So okay, so yeah, there are many systems, and for strength considerations I use the one that Robert Schmidt introduced me to, which is quite simple, and it's also very elegant, but it also has a certain convincing quality to it, in my opinion. So, and that's the equal places, for which I use the degree, the portion of the horoscopos of the ascendant, the rising portion, the rising degree, as we would call it now, and this degree is placed in all the succeedent places following after the rising image. And then what you see in the Hitler's chart is that the first and the third triplicity ruler really gain much strength, simply because they are in the seventh region of this chart. So there is perhaps reason to believe that triplicity rulers are quite strong. Having said that, then you should have also concluded that the first period of life must have been quite good. Well, he had a relatively good youth, but he was having much difficulty with his father, so that was a problem for him. So yeah, as I said, perhaps it's more difficult to try to use the universal significations simply by the place location. But in this case, the conjunction of Aries with Aphrodite is a sort of a spoiler, because it really produced much difficulty in his first years, simply by being rejected at the Academy of Vienna. So he could not become an artist as he would have liked. So yeah, there we have that. That issue is quite interesting. So yeah, we see the promotion of certain planets in his chart to being quite strong. The ability to manifest is quite strong, and these are having to do with 5 planets, which is Mercury, the Sun, Venus, Mars, and Saturn. And of course, yes, Mercury is there as well, being conjunct the degree, the portion of the descendant. So that is the most strong one, and it remains the strong one also in the whole sign house places. So yeah, here you got a difference having to do with the cusp locations. I'm not sure what this means, the Moon and Jupiter being dynamically cadent, which seems to suggest that their power of manifestation is relatively weak, but they have strong significations for the 4th place, because the goat horned one is the 4th image of this in whole sign places. So yeah, this is the issue with dynamical considerations, and please understand that because Venus, Mars and Hēlios are now in the 7th place, that they would have anything to do with the topical issues of the 7th place. They do not. This is simply about strength and not about the things that they represent in this chart. There's one exception, because Valens says that he mixes them. He does, because when the MC is, for instance, in the 9th place, then he says that the topics of the 9th place get mixed up with the 10th place. I'm not sure if he does this for all the other images, and I think there's reason to understand that he would do that for the MC when it's in the 9th or the 11th or even the 8th or 12th place. And that would also go for the IC, I think, because that's also an angular point, a pivot, prodding, prodding something which is in it. So that could be understood as mixing the qualities, the topics of the 9th and the 10th place whenever the MC is actually in the 9th whole sign place. So, okay, so let's have a look at other stuff. Okay, the second method of trying to investigate eminence is by means of the specific lots that Valens used. Of course, fortune, the exaltation, a lot of spirit and a lot of basis. So let's have a look at that. And when we check out how the evaluation by Valens was done, we can see that there are no specific lot eminence indicators in this method. But there's something that's quite interesting. So let's take note of the fact that the exaltation is in the 1st place. And Valens says in Book 2, Chapter 19, for if the exaltation, should be found to be marking the hour, which is the case here, it's in the ascendant, especially upon a pivot point of the lot. This might be presumably the lot of fortune, but it could also be a pivot of the exaltation itself. And here we see indeed that this is the case, because the lot of exaltations is in the fortune IC, the 4th place relative to the lot of fortune. And then Valens continues, this figure foretells one who is royal, with the remaining stars and sects showing the support of the nativity to be great. Yeah, the 2nd period was of course quite great, so then yeah, his eminence rose. That's interesting. The domicile master of the exaltation is Venus. There we have him again. Aphrodite is also the 1st triple ruler, and she is co-present with the sect light. So that seems relative to the idea of eminence. And it's in the 8th place, and also conjunct Mars, who is the 3rd triplicity ruler. And in the 3rd period of his life, everything fell down, of course, because of World War II and the defeat of Germany. The sect light is also the domicile master of the zenith, the MC, the 10th by portion, which is the MC itself. That's interesting. Okay. Now, something needs to be said about the idea of eminence, and it's closely associated with the idea of happiness and success in life, and this is often referred to by later authors having to do with things in a material sense. It's about money, property, status and income, livelihood, and Dorotheus of Sidon also links it to one's health, which is logical because that creates a sense of well-being. But the interesting thing is that these are also the subjects attributed to the lot of fortune, the body, illness, crisis, fortune, and things befalling the native. And that's the reason why the fortune houses, of course, are very important in this investigation. And triplicity lords, and especially the pivots of the lot of fortune, this is also well known, they must be taken into account. And the interesting thing is that when the eminence factors having to do with the triplicity rulers, and perhaps even these special lots by Valens, when these do not promise eminence or happiness, then they all refer or default to the system, the careful study of investigating the lot of fortune. and for investigated the general fortune in the life and the possible eminence as a result of it, because when people are very wealthy, for instance, then they can be more prominent or eminent in their life and in society. So the interesting thing is that we see here that Hitler's lot of fortune is in the 10th place, the whole sign place, and the ruler, both domicile masters of the crab are of course the moon herself and Jupiter, Zeus, and these are conjunct in an angle of fortune. So that's a pretty interesting thing. Something people didn't perhaps not know is that the book that Hitler produced, Mein Kampf, my battle, my struggle, was mandatory reading for the whole population of Germany. So he became a millionaire because of this, the books sold of his book. So that was something that was perhaps not quite well known, but he was very wealthy because of this book. So interesting. And here we have the last investigation having to do with eminence, which is the three kinds of spear bearing. Again, here you see the definitions of them, which I introduced in the previous video. And something need to be addressed because, as I said then, this is the thing that gives me a headache, and you will see that it still does, because some things are simply not clear to me, and I explained in the previous video that we perhaps all have something in the teachings of astrology that somehow doesn't click or doesn't get, how do you say, easy for me to access. And you will see this, there are some things that I simply do not quite understand fully about this spear bearing. And that last one, the last remark in the green box of Antiochus says, nevertheless, trigonal spear bearers are better than tetragonal ones or diametrical ones. So that suggests that diametrical opposition, planets diametrically in opposition with, for instance, the satellites, are regarded as spear bearing. So I'm not quite sure whether or not that's truly the case, because some people will say that spear bearing only refers to the image where for instance, Hēlios is, and the image rising before that, and that's where the actual spear bearing happens. But we've seen examples where that is not the case and simply used all kinds of configurations with satellites. So, okay, let's investigate the chart of Hitler. So, of course, we first investigate the sect-light. Now, as you can see, the sect-light, the sun, is not pivotal in the whole sign places, but it was in the cusp places in the dynamical division. I'm not quite sure whether or not that is a valid consideration, but in later astrology, the sect-lights were always investigated as whether or not they had spear bearers or not. So let's have a look for the sun. So the question is, are planets posited before Hēlios, the sun, and that's maybe up to a trigonal distance between them, which is of course behind him zodiacally. So he's moving away from them, and these planets are casting their rays towards the sun. As you can see, the sun is moving away from the moon and Jupiter, in relation to the images that they are in, which means for Jupiter that he's becoming retrograde pretty soon after this birth, simply because the moon, Hēlios, the sun, is moving away from Jupiter because he's the faster one, and whenever the slower planets get into this distance, they turn retrograde until they become in the chronicle position where the sun is in opposition to them, etc., etc. That's the heliacal phases for you. Okay, so let's have a look. The first one that really comes to the fore is, of course, Mercury. And you can see here Mercury is in the bounds of Saturn, and I'm not sure which author it was, but and I found this very interesting simply because the teaching about the confines is that planets are sort of aiming their own manner of working or manifesting in the terms and the confines of the planet that is in which bound it is. So what I do now is whenever Mercury, because rising before the Hēlios is one of the most well-known usages of trying to determine to which sect Mercury belongs, but when it is indeed the case that the confines have a very restrictive sense in the manner how a planet functions, then you can say in this case for Mercury that whenever he is in the bounds of a diurnal planet like he is here, you can perhaps say that he's a diurnal planet by the manner in which he functions. And never forget that Mercury is well with benefics and not so good with malefics. So Mercury actually doesn't care much. He simply works with whatever comes his way or whatever condition he is in. So for me, nowadays I use the confines of Mercury to determine whether or not he is a diurnal planet or a nocturnal planet in his manner of manifesting himself. So that's why I do this. Now the interesting thing is, of course, that Hitler became very popular and very famous because of his speeches. And I don't know if you ever heard him speak, but it's really a very martial way of speaking, because he worked himself up into a frenzy and then, aroused the people around him, and that was the reason why he became so popular. There's an interesting thing that Robert Schmidt mentioned in his tutorial on zodiacal releasing. If you have it, there is really an excellent delineation of the manner in which Hitler did things, how he acted, which is based on the delineation of his lot of spirit, his daimon, in being in the water pourer under the rule of Saturn, who is then the way in which he used to approach his activities. Very interesting. Please refer to that if you have the chance, because it's excellent. So he pointed this out as Saturn is a planet of hypokritos, which is hypocrisy, theatrical performances, art, and oratorical display, theater. And he is the Hellenistic planet of deception and feigned behavior and appearance. And because Mercury, the planet of speech, is pivotal and in the confines, the bounds of Saturn, Hitler's speaking is therefore channeled through Saturn. And the interesting thing is that Saturn is the theater. And there are photos of Hitler, as you can see here, in which he is actually training his poses before a mirror, trying to see how effective they are. So he used the theatrical arts to deliver speeches, and that really manifested and worked. So he channeled his speaking through mannerisms of things in the theater. So dramatic poses to enforce the things you were saying. So that's interesting. So yeah, this is Saturn putting on a mask, and it's feigned appearance. It's not showing yourself as you are, but you are impersonating someone or something or whatever. Now, the interesting thing also is that Ptolemy said, I'm not a fan of Ptolemy, but in this case this might be interesting for Mercury. The kind of future honor is to be divined from the quality of the attending planets, the spear bearers, for if Mercury governs the attendants, he brings about that which depends upon intelligence, education, and the care and management of affairs. So education, the Hitler Youth is, of course, a very typical use of training the young. And these were, of course, were all trained in the politics and the visions and the ideas of the Nazi regime, as inspired by Hitler. So yeah, that's Mercury for you. Looking at spear bearers again, because these planets, both the Moon and Jupiter, are trine in a trigonal configuration with Hēlios being in the bull, then we can perhaps say that Jupiter is a spear bearer for Hēlios. And it would also be the case because Jupiter is casting a ray into the sextile image of Pisces, as does the Moon. So yeah, whether or not you consider this trigonal location itself as being a spear bearer, or you consider the sextile into Pisces as being representative of Jupiter being a spear bearer. So that's not much difference here. Now, what is the interesting thing? The interesting thing is that Jupiter is placed in the 4th house, having to do with this building. I'm trying to find the English word, but I can't remember it. But you can see the buildings here are immense, so they are very, very big, which is of course something having to do with Jupiter being a bit out of bound, in the sense that Jupiter is not in a place, is in its depression, and whenever a planet is not in dignity, then it goes overboard sometimes. So you can see here how this functions in the issues having to do with Jupiter as a representative of perhaps a spear bearer for Hitler's Hēlios, because this is what he attempted to do. He was much into architecture. Oh, that was the word I was trying to find in a previous slide. Hitler was quite able to simply draw from the mind simply some very decent images, drawings having to do with architecture. So that's interesting. But there's another thing that's also quite representative of this Jupiter influence as a protection, perhaps. Jupiter is, of course, always grand and spectacular and imposing because it's together with the Hēlios, and Hēlios has to do with grand stuff, as does Jupiter. So there's he put on very, very big and spectacular and imposing shows. And of course, this Jupiter is conjunct the Moon, which is representative of the masses. So here you can see some of the things that Hitler did and his entourage did to promote Hitler's politics, etc., etc., the Nazi doctrines. So yeah, these are pretty impressive, right? Jupiter Sun, Jupiter Moon. Impressive, spectacular shows for your entertainment. Now, as you can see, the Moon is also in the range having to do with the trigonal distance between Hēlios and Sēlenē, the Moon herself. And again, when you do not consider this, you can also say that the Moon is spear-bearing because she casts a sextile hexagonal ray into Pisces. So yeah, the Moon is also pivotal, as is Jupiter. And the interesting thing is that this also represents something that was much promoted by the Nazi regime, which is called Blut und Boden, which is translated as blood and soil. Soil in the sense of things having to do with agriculture. So this was one of the things that Hitler promoted and his regime. It had to do with Lebensraum, room for the Germans to expand their society, and of course that led to ideas about the agricultural politics and the need for much land to be able to feed the German people and feed the ever-growing German Reich. So yeah, that's also this moon being in the 4th place, having to do with agriculture. And there was even a magazine having to do with this idea about Blut und Boden, and this one is from December 1939. So, and it's the Ausgabe 23, I think. And Odal is, of course, a reference to mythology, ancient history, which was often used, the sort of Norse influence of the mysticism having to do with the ancient ideas about Aryans, the people being blonde and having blue eyes, etc., coming from the north, the most superior race that ever existed in the misconceptions of the Nazi regime. So again, here we see the moon and Jupiter both together having to do something with expansion, expanding the Boden, the Lebensraum, the room to live in for the German people. Jupiter, big expansion, and the moon having to do with agriculture in the 4th place, of course, in this image of an Earth-like nature being Capricorn. So the interesting thing, of course, is also when we consider the idea of the satellite itself, Hēlios, and we consider the significations of Jupiter, Zeus. When we look at Valence, what he says about Zeus is the planet of opinion, crowns of office, and of will. And of course, the triumph of the will, the Triumph des Willens, that was a very important political statement having to do with Hitler and his following. So that's also an interesting feature of perhaps the satellite in combination with Jupiter, both having to do with being strong-willed, as you would have it. Okay, let's have a look at the spear bearers for Sēlenē. Again, Sēlenē is the light in this chart, which is actually pivotal. So perhaps that has a somewhat more impact, perhaps, than the ones having to do with Hēlios, but as you will see, this is not the case in Hitler's charts, because all the spear bearers have a certain function having to do with his life and his career. So this is the region where we need to find spear bearers for Sēlenē. So let's have a look. Let's first our planet's position behind the moon in the diurnal motion, which is before her zodiacally. Of course, there we have Jupiter. Now this is perhaps the best thing one can have, simply because the moon is the dispositor of fortune. So fortune is represented by the moon in this case, and it's strongly protected by Jupiter, who is also one of the rulers, the ruler by exaltation of the crab, and they are both together in an angle, and that's also an angle relative to fortune. So yeah, this is a very, very strong significator of protection, I think, because that's what spear bearers do, right? And this is protection for the moon. So that's interesting. The other question is, are planets casting rays behind Sēlenē in the diurnal motion, which is before her zodiacally, so that she moves towards these configurations? Now, as I said before, this is what confuses me. Some teachings say that the opposition needs to be discarded. I'm not quite sure, because when you have Saturn in opposition to the place where the moon is moving to, then the question is whether or not he's actually protecting. I don't know. I just don't know. And here you see the other planets having beneficial contacts, casting beneficial rays into the images to which the moon is moving. But in my view, I think the conjunction of the moon with Jupiter is the strongest indication of the fortune that is considered having to do with eminence. And of course, the moon is the second triplicity ruler of his chart. So yeah, there you have it again. It's somehow connected with fate in his life. That's what you can say about it. Now, before I go on with my exposition of this idea of protection by means of spear bearing, I want to give you something to consider. Because Schmidt often mentioned the three grand approaches, which are the universal techniques, the topical analysis, and the Time Lords. And the universal techniques simply give a very broad description of somebody's life, sometimes even in a few sentences. And the 7 methods to investigate these universal principles, the outlines of somebody's life, the things that all biographers would mention simply because it's so typical for this person, are done by the rising decanate, the archodespotes, the triplicity rulers, there we have them, the hermetic lots, the planets in the places and their dispositors, the microzodiac, which is the 12 parts, and finally the applications and separations of Sēlenē, the moon. So that's interesting, but what's more interesting and perhaps more relevant to this issue is that quite general principles are used for these investigations. So there is no actual deeper research into the significators. They are just very general ones, and that's it. Take, for instance, the triplicity rulers. The question simply is which triplicity ruler is angular? And if so, that's indicative of a happy or good period of life. So it's the first one that's happy or good, the second one more happy or better, depending on the condition, whether or not the triplicity ruler is in an angle, in a pivot or not. And that's the end of the investigation and the delineation. So that is quite, well, I wouldn't say superficial, but it's quite simple, right? The end of the investigation, you look for the triplicity rulers. When it's angular, that's the best period. End of delineation. So that's interesting. What I also find very interesting is that normally quite general significations of the astrologicals involved are used for this investigation. So I'm thinking, when we're talking about protection by spear bearers, what exactly is protected then? So, and then when we take the more general or universal significations of, for instance, Hēlios, then we are talking about this: kingly office, hegemony, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, the mind, hegemony, the mind, practical wisdom, outward form, height of fortune, public registration, what I think is popularity, action, and popular leadership. So when we're talking about the spear bearers for Hēlios, then this is what is protected. And now we take the principle of the general universal significations of the moon. We're talking about life, body, one's person, property, fortune, city, the gathering of crowds, which is the masses, of course. So perhaps we can make a difference between what is actually protected by the spear bearers of both the lights in the chart. So there's a difference, I think, between what is protected when the sun is protected, Hēlios, and there's a difference between Hēlios and Sēlenē when talking about spear bearers. What is protected when the moon is protected by spear bearers? So when we're looking at Hitler's chart and you take the general or universal significations of Sēlenē, then Jupiter is protecting Hitler's what? His life, his body, his person, by popularity, by the means that Jupiter does this. So when you say, yeah, there were 42 or some lesser attempts on the life of Adolf Hitler, then you can really say that his body, his life was protected by a planet, because he escaped all of them, and in the end he had to kill himself to end his own life. So wow, that's pretty amazing. So again, whenever Jupiter is one of the spear bearers, this is very promising of a very good protection somehow. Yeah. What's also interesting is that there is much speculation, because I'm seeing that Jupiter is the ruler of the 6th place, that Hitler was ill in many ways and that he had a sort of dependency on drugs and whatnot. That might be the case simply because Jupiter rules the 6th place. That's the way or the issues with which his life, his body, his person was protected. And it could be by medicine, right? So yeah, it's protecting him from an early grave, simply because they're in the 4th place, and the grave is the 4th place according to the traditional astrology. The moon is the dispositor of the lot of fortune, together with the exaltation rule of fortune. Again, very, very, very strong positive significations. And the moon and Jupiter in the 7th from the lot of fortune are suggestive of powerfully attracting a certain type of people, Saturnine in nature, and a strong or beneficial protection against them, the 7th being the location of possible attacks. So yeah. So my hypothesis is that spear-bearing for the moon is perhaps more about protecting from actual physical harm, the body. I'm not quite sure if that is can be validated by other examples, but in this case it seems to be the case. So yeah. Having a further look at this, so yeah, my guess is that Jupiter is protecting Hitler's body, his physical stuff, his body, his life. And you can see also that the moon and Jupiter are both the domicile masters of the 10th place, the 10th Hosan place, the place at the peak as it's called. And of course they have strong signification for that. And fortune being in the 10th Hosan place suggests that Tugé, fate, is strongly associated with the significations of the 10th place, which is about honor, popularity, and especially in the fatherland, because her dispositors, the moon and Jupiter, are in the 4th place. And that's quite interesting, simply because the moon is conjunct Jupiter, and the moon is of course the masses, and Jupiter has a certain amount of popularity when he's doing that. The first foundation for the creation of authority is always provided by popularity, says Adolf Hitler himself. So yeah, he was very popular, as we all know, as you could be seen in all the pictures of him, like these. He was quite popular, yeah. And the interesting thing is that this fatherland wasn't even his own fatherland. Germany was not the place where he was born. He was born in Austria. So that's also pretty strange. And the interesting thing is that this is a signification of another signification of Kronos, the domicile master of the 4th place. Kronos doesn't own things, but takes care of them for others. Think children that are adopted. So then when you are an adoptive parent, then you're taking care of somebody else's child, and that's a signification of Saturn. You don't own it, you take care of it. And another interesting thing that Schmidt pointed out was that Hitler did not initially see himself as the leader, president of Germany, but rather the program director, which is to be associated with Saturn and Venus. He wanted to be chancellor and not president, so he first resisted the idea Saturn square the Sun, that he was to be the president. But when he succumbed to that, he wanted to be the only one, which is typical for Saturn, of course, again, and the Sun as well. So yeah, so there was something dark about the charisma of Hitler, and that's for the masses, and that has something to do with Saturn being, of course, the ruler of both the moon and Jupiter, the moon being a significator of the masses. Interesting. So what is protected when we're talking about Hēlios, the sun? Well, again, the specific significations, or perhaps the more general ones: kingly office, mind, practical wisdom, outward form, hate of fortune, public registration, popular leadership. So that is what is protected by all the planets preceding Hēlios in rising. So yeah, these are the things that furthered his career, as it were, and his position in society in Germany. So again, a hypothesis, all the spear bearers of the Sun, Hēlios, represent perhaps all the political actions, the ideology of the Nazi administration that furthered, supported, or popularized and protected his position in the kingly office that he achieved. So yeah, there we have it. Again, Blut und Boredom, all the things, all the political issues on the agenda of the Nazi regime, and of course his exaltations when he was doing his speeches, exalted, being sort of performing his skills in that, if you could call it that. So let's have a look at a chart of a person who unfortunately was assassinated while in office. So again, my hypothesis is that the spear bearing for the moon is perhaps more about protecting from actual physical harm, the body, which in this case was not, of course, not the case, as he was assassinated. Well, let's have a look. At first, when you see the spear bearers for Hēlios, they are pretty good in the sense that Jupiter is there, belonging to the sect in favor. You have Mercury, we have Mars, not belonging to the sect in favor. But as we saw in many delineation examples of the ancients, this was not quite a problem, except that whenever Aries is, of course, functioning or happening or being a spear bearer, that might indicate, and him not being of the sect might indicate some issues there. So again, this has something to do, I think, perhaps more specifically for a person in this position, because I took him as an example because he was the president, of course, and that, of course, guarantees a certain eminence beforehand, even if you do not investigate this chart as such. But it's interesting because when you look at the triplicity rulers, you see that the first one is Saturn and it's conjunct the MC. So yeah, that's a pretty strong indication of somebody being born probably in sort of a aristocratic family, which was somehow said about the Kennedys, because they are a lineage which is very eminent in America's history. And one of his brothers was also assassinated, Bobby Kennedy, with which he performed his first term in office. But again, his office was cut short because he was assassinated. Let's look at the protection for the moon. And here we see the moon being all by herself in the 12th place, of course, which is not that good. Ruler of the 10th place, that is interesting because whenever the ruler of the 10th place is in the 12th place, that is not very good for your profession or something, and perhaps Saturn being in anti-domicile also has some issues there. I'm thinking this might have something to do with the reason why he was assassinated, because it's often suggested that this was perhaps done by a secret organization operative in America, be it one of the official agencies, be it the CIA, be it the FBI. There's much thought about that and much speculation and many conspiracy theories about what actually happened and who did it, who was the culprit of this assassination. Well, you can see here that the moon is moving towards no planet, but she is moving towards certain rays cast by planets. And again, here's my big question. Is the opposition indicative of a protective planet, or is it something having to do with something that is not that beneficial, or rather cannot be considered a spear-bearing planet for, in this case, Sēlenē, protecting his body, the physical appearance, etc. We also see Saturn being the planet belonging to the first triplicity ruler, very strong in the MC. So Saturn is very relative to the issue of somebody's way of life in the sense of proceeding through life and the office that one can achieve perhaps. And that one is protecting the moon, but perhaps it's also the other way around, because one of the definitions says that a planet in an angle, which in this case is Saturn, the lights can act as a spear bearer for such a planet. So perhaps here we are talking about the moon spear bearing for Saturn. So this is a conundrum for me. I'm not quite understanding, unless it's really about physical proximity. As you can see, the spear bearers for the Sun are pretty strong planets, many planets as well. So yeah, he of course was a very popular young president. And you can see that the moon is not protected when it comes to proximity, planets being in the images after rising after Sēlenē, or formulated the other way, in the images where she is moving towards by her progression through the images. So, okay. So this finishes my fourth presentation on the issue of spear bearing, protection, eminence, and in this case I was addressing the issue of protection. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you next time, and I hope this was instructive in any way, shape or form, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a thumbs up, and the next video will be produced perhaps in 2 weeks, because there will be a short holiday coming up for the Netherlands. And in the next one I will be addressing the second topic, having to do with spear bearing, which was presented to us by Vetjes Valens, saying that whenever a person reaches some high eminence, the malefics in the chart of that person harm bystanders more than it does the native, etc. So we will be addressing that next time, and I hope you enjoyed it, and enjoy your further studies of this somewhat complex topic. Thank you, and again, I see you next time.